You notice it in small moments. Someone around you is quiet, and something inside you tightens. Maybe they didn't answer your message the same way. Maybe their tone changed slightly. Maybe they just looked tired. But almost instantly, a thought appears: did I do something wrong? You replay the last conversation in your head. The words you used. The way you said them. You start scanning the moment, looking for the mistake. Because somehow, their mood begins to feel like your responsibility. If they seem distant, you feel uneasy. If they look upset, you feel guilty. If the atmosphere becomes tense, your mind immediately starts searching for a way to fix it. You adjust your tone. You become softer. More careful. More attentive. You try to lighten the mood. Not because someone asked you to, but because something inside you learned, a long time ago, that when people around you are not okay, something is wrong. Maybe you recognize this pattern. You apologize even when you're not sure what you did. You feel responsible for conflicts that weren't yours. You carry the emotional weight of the room without anyone asking you to. From the outside, it looks like kindness. Like empathy. Like being considerate. But inside, it doesn't feel calm. It feels like pressure. Like you are constantly monitoring everyone around you, trying to keep the emotional balance from collapsing. Because if someone is upset, if someone is disappointed, if someone is hurt, a quiet voice inside you starts whispering, "This might be your fault." And if you recognize yourself in these patterns, you might find a lot of value in the conversations we have here. You can subscribe if you want to continue exploring them with us. Because the real question is not why you care about people. The real question is, when did you start feeling responsible for everyone's feelings? Maybe you don't notice it immediately. It happens quietly. Someone around you changes their tone just a little. A message arrives shorter than usual. A conversation feels slightly colder than it did a few minutes ago. And before anything is even said, something inside you becomes alert. Your attention shifts. You start scanning the moment. Not in a dramatic way. Not consciously. But your mind begins to look for something. A mistake. A detail. A word you might have said wrong. Because somehow, when the emotional atmosphere around you changes, your first instinct is not curiosity. It's responsibility. You start thinking, did I cause this? Maybe it was the way you answered. Maybe your tone sounded distant. Maybe you should have been more careful. So you replay the moment. The conversation. The exact sentence you used. Sometimes you even replay the expression on your own face, trying to remember if you looked impatient, distracted, or cold. And while the other person may simply be tired, or thinking about something else entirely, your mind is already working. Trying to stabilize the emotional space around you. You might ask softly, "Are you okay?" Not just out of care, but out of something deeper. A quiet need to make sure the emotional atmosphere hasn't shifted because of you. And if they say something like, "Yeah, I'm fine," but the tone still feels slightly distant, your mind keeps searching. Maybe they're upset but don't want to say it. Maybe you missed something. Maybe you hurt them without realizing it. So you become more careful. Your voice softens. Your words become more deliberate. You adjust yourself in small ways. Not because anyone asked you to, but because something inside you learned that emotional tension around you is something you're supposed to notice, and fix. And after a while, this process becomes automatic. You start paying attention to everyone's emotional signals. The pauses in someone's voice. The way someone sighs. The slight delay before they answer. Tiny changes that most people might not even notice. But you do. And each one triggers the same quiet question inside your mind: is something wrong? And if something feels wrong, your next instinct is to make sure you didn't cause it. This can show up in very subtle ways. You apologize quickly, sometimes before you fully understand what happened. You say things like, "I'm sorry if that sounded wrong." Or, "I didn't mean it like that." Even when no one directly accused you of anything. Sometimes you even feel the need to explain yourself before the other person has said a single word. Just in case. Just to prevent things from getting worse. And from the outside, this can look like kindness. It can look like empathy. Like you're simply someone who cares deeply about others. But inside, the experience is different. Inside, it doesn't feel like simple care. It feels like pressure. A constant awareness of the emotional environment. Almost like your nervous system is always scanning the room. Making sure everything feels stable. Because when something shifts, when someone seems distant, when tension appears, you feel it immediately. And part of you believes that if you don't respond quickly enough, if you don't soften your tone, if you don't fix the moment, something could break. A relationship. A connection. The fragile emotional balance between you and the people around you. And sometimes, this responsibility extends far beyond obvious situations. You might feel uneasy if someone is disappointed. Even if their disappointment has nothing to do with you. You might feel uncomfortable when someone is sad. Not because their sadness is wrong, but because part of you feels like you should be able to make it disappear. You listen carefully. You try to say the right thing. You search for words that might ease the situation. Because when someone near you is hurting, something inside you starts whispering, "Do something. Fix it. Make it better." And if the situation doesn't improve, if the other person remains upset or distant, the quiet voice inside your mind starts to shift. It becomes heavier. More critical. More certain. Maybe you did something wrong after all. Maybe you weren't attentive enough. Maybe you should have noticed earlier. And slowly, almost without realizing it, you begin carrying emotional responsibilities that were never actually yours. The mood of the room. The comfort of others. The stability of relationships. All of it begins to feel like something you are supposed to maintain. And over time, this creates a strange dynamic inside you. You become extremely attentive to other people's emotions, but much less attentive to your own. Because when so much of your energy is focused on keeping everyone else okay, there is very little space left to notice what is happening inside you. Your discomfort. Your fatigue. Your quiet resentment. Those feelings often get pushed aside. Because the moment someone else around you seems upset, your attention moves outward again. Trying to restore balance. Trying to make things calm again. But this raises a deeper question. Because patterns like this rarely appear out of nowhere. They usually begin somewhere much earlier. In moments when paying attention to other people's emotional states wasn't just a form of kindness, but something that felt necessary. Almost like a survival skill. And to understand why other people's emotions started feeling like your responsibility, we need to go back to where this pattern often begins. Patterns like this rarely appear out of nowhere. The habit of constantly monitoring the emotional atmosphere around you, of feeling responsible when someone is upset, of trying to stabilize relationships before they fall apart, usually begins much earlier than we realize. Often in places where emotional tension was something you had to learn to notice very quickly. Not because someone taught you directly. but because your environment quietly trained you to do it. Maybe there were moments growing up when the emotional climate in the house could change suddenly. A shift in tone. A door closing a little harder than usual. A conversation stopping abruptly. And even if no one explained what was happening, your body learned to pay attention. Children are incredibly sensitive to emotional signals. They notice changes in voice, posture, silence. They learn very quickly when something feels unstable. And when emotional tension appears repeatedly in a child's environment, something subtle starts to happen. The child begins trying to understand how to make the situation calmer. Not because they are told to, but because the emotional discomfort around them becomes impossible to ignore. Sometimes this happens in families where adults carry a lot of stress. A parent overwhelmed by work. A caregiver struggling with their own emotions. A household where conversations easily turn tense. In situations like these, children often develop a quiet strategy. They start becoming very attentive to other people's moods. They watch carefully. Trying to predict what might happen next. Trying to sense when something is about to go wrong. And slowly, without realizing it, they begin adjusting themselves. Speaking more softly. Avoiding certain topics. Trying to behave in ways that keep the atmosphere calm. At first, this adjustment is simply a response to the environment. But over time, it can turn into something deeper. A belief. A quiet conclusion the child forms about relationships. That emotional stability depends on how carefully they manage the situation. So they start taking small emotional responsibilities. If someone is upset, maybe they should be extra kind. If someone seems distant, maybe they should try harder to connect. If tension appears, maybe they should fix it. This doesn't necessarily mean the adults in their life expected this. In many cases, no one explicitly asked the child to take on this role. But children are incredibly good at sensing emotional gaps. And when they feel those gaps, they often step into them instinctively. Trying to restore balance. Trying to keep things from becoming overwhelming. In some families, this might look like the child becoming the easy one. The one who doesn't cause problems. The one who tries to keep the peace. They learn very early that their behavior can influence the emotional atmosphere. And because of that, they begin paying closer and closer attention. Over time, this sensitivity becomes part of their personality. They grow into someone who reads emotional signals quickly. Someone who notices subtle changes in tone. Someone who can sense when something is wrong before anyone says a word. From the outside, this often looks like emotional intelligence. And in many ways, it is. But there is also a hidden cost. Because when you grow up believing that emotional harmony depends on how well you manage situations, you start carrying responsibilities that were never meant to be yours. The feelings of others begin to feel connected to your actions. If someone becomes distant, maybe you did something wrong. If someone is disappointed, maybe you failed them. If someone is upset, maybe you should have prevented it. And even when those assumptions are not accurate, the pattern remains. Your nervous system continues scanning for signs of emotional instability. Trying to prevent discomfort before it grows. This is why, as an adult, you might find yourself reacting so strongly to small emotional shifts. A slightly colder message. A friend who suddenly becomes quiet. A partner who seems distracted. Situations that might simply reflect normal fluctuations in mood can feel much more significant inside you. Because somewhere deep in your emotional memory, those signals were once important. They once meant something needed attention. Something needed to be stabilized. Something needed to be fixed. And when your mind encounters similar signals today, it automatically activates the same response. Scan the situation. Look for the cause. Adjust yourself. Prevent the emotional atmosphere from collapsing. But here is the difficult part. As a child, being attentive to emotional signals may have genuinely helped you navigate your environment. It may have helped you stay safe. It may have helped you avoid conflict. It may have helped you maintain connection with the people around you. But the strategies we develop in childhood often remain active long after the original environment has changed. Your nervous system doesn't automatically update those patterns. It simply continues using the strategies that once worked. And that is why, even in relationships where no one expects you to manage their emotions, you may still feel the same quiet pressure. To notice everything. To respond quickly. To prevent discomfort before it spreads. And this creates a strange paradox in adult relationships. Because the same sensitivity that once helped you understand others can begin to exhaust you. You become someone who is constantly aware of the emotional atmosphere. Constantly adjusting. Constantly trying to maintain balance. Sometimes without even realizing you are doing it. You might enter a room and instantly sense when something feels tense. You might notice when someone's energy changes. You might feel responsible for smoothing conversations that start becoming uncomfortable. And while other people simply experience emotions, you feel compelled to manage them. Which means that over time, relationships can begin to feel heavier for you than they do for others. Because you are not only participating in the relationship. You are also silently monitoring its emotional stability. And that is an exhausting role to carry. Especially when no one ever officially assigned it to you. But patterns like this rarely stay contained within one area of life. Once they develop, they tend to follow us into many different kinds of relationships. Friendships. Romantic connections. Work environments. Even casual social situations. The habit of scanning emotional signals, of adjusting yourself, of trying to maintain harmony, can begin appearing everywhere. And that is when the pattern becomes most visible. Not in childhood. But in the way it continues repeating itself throughout adult life. Because even when you are surrounded by people who do not expect you to carry their emotional weight, part of you may still feel like that responsibility belongs to you. And that is where we start to see how deeply this pattern can shape the way you move through relationships today. And this is where the pattern becomes most visible. Not in childhood. But in the way it quietly shapes your relationships as an adult. Because by the time you grow up, the habit of paying attention to everyone's emotions is no longer something you consciously think about. It simply feels normal. You enter a room, and almost automatically, part of your attention starts observing. Who looks comfortable? Who seems tense? Who might be slightly distant? You might not even realize you're doing it. But your mind is already reading the emotional atmosphere. And once you notice a shift, the same familiar process begins. Your attention narrows. Your mind starts searching for the cause. Did I say something wrong? Did my tone change? Did I miss something important? Sometimes this happens in conversations that appear completely ordinary from the outside. You might be talking with someone you care about. The conversation is flowing normally. Then suddenly the other person becomes a little quieter. Maybe they pause longer before answering. Maybe their voice loses some of its warmth. And instantly your body reacts. A small tension appears inside you. Your mind becomes alert, because something about the emotional atmosphere has shifted. And without even realizing it, you begin doing the same thing you learned long ago. Trying to stabilize the moment. You might soften your voice. You might become more attentive. You might try to make the conversation lighter. Sometimes you ask, "Did I say something wrong?" Or, "Are you upset with me?" Even when the other person hadn't actually expressed any dissatisfaction. But the emotional shift was enough to activate the old pattern. The quiet assumption that something in the relationship may need repair. This can also appear in the way you handle conflict. When tension begins rising in a conversation, your instinct might not be to defend your perspective. It might be to restore emotional calm. You might start apologizing quickly. Even when you're not completely sure what you're apologizing for. You might say things like, "I didn't mean it like that." Or, "I'm sorry if that came out wrong." Because the discomfort of emotional tension can feel almost unbearable. Your mind wants to fix it immediately. To bring the atmosphere back to stability. And while this reaction often comes from genuine care, it can slowly change the balance of your relationships. Because when one person constantly takes responsibility for maintaining emotional harmony, they also begin carrying a disproportionate amount of emotional weight. Over time, this can create an invisible pressure inside you. You start feeling responsible not only for your own behavior, but for how the other person feels about it. And this responsibility doesn't stay limited to obvious conflicts. It can appear in very subtle moments. For example, when someone close to you seems distant. Maybe they are simply tired after a long day. Maybe their mind is occupied with something unrelated. But your mind starts connecting their mood to you. You begin wondering if you disappointed them. If you said something insensitive. If you failed to notice something important. And even if the other person later explains that nothing was wrong, your body may still carry the tension for a while. Because the emotional alarm had already been activated. This pattern can also affect the way you experience closeness in relationships. When someone becomes emotionally open with you, when they share their struggles, their sadness, their fears, many people respond with empathy. But if you carry this deeper sense of responsibility for other people's emotions, something else can happen. Their pain can start feeling like a problem you need to solve. You listen carefully. You search for the right words. You try to make them feel better. You try to reduce their suffering. Because simply witnessing someone else's emotions can feel incomplete. Part of you believes you should be able to change them. To help them feel okay again. And when that doesn't happen, when the other person remains sad or frustrated despite your efforts, a familiar feeling appears. A subtle sense of failure. As if you somehow didn't do enough. Even though their emotions were never yours to control. Another place where this pattern becomes visible is in the way you anticipate other people's reactions. Before saying something honest, you might already imagine how the other person could feel. If you think your words might upset them, you hesitate. You soften the message. Sometimes you avoid saying it altogether. Not because you don't know what you feel, but because you are already imagining the emotional consequences. You are already trying to prevent discomfort. This can make it surprisingly difficult to express certain needs. To say no. To disagree openly. To place boundaries. Because boundaries often create emotional reactions. And when someone else reacts with disappointment, frustration, or sadness, your instinct may be to step back. To reduce the tension. To smooth things out again. Which means that sometimes, without realizing it, you sacrifice your own needs in order to maintain emotional harmony. At first, this might not seem like a problem. After all, caring about other people's feelings is generally seen as a positive quality. But when the responsibility becomes one-sided, when you constantly feel responsible for the emotional stability of relationships, something else begins to appear. Fatigue. Not dramatic exhaustion, but a quiet emotional tiredness. You might notice that certain interactions leave you drained, even when nothing explicitly difficult happened. Because while the conversation may have seemed normal on the surface, your mind was working the entire time. Monitoring, adjusting, trying to maintain balance. And after a while, carrying that invisible responsibility begins to weigh on you. Especially when the people around you are simply expressing their emotions naturally, while you are trying to manage them. This can create a strange internal conflict. On one side, you genuinely care about people. You want them to feel safe. You want relationships to feel harmonious. But on the other side, part of you may begin feeling overwhelmed by the emotional responsibility you carry. You might start asking yourself questions like, why do I feel responsible for everything? Why does someone else's mood affect me so much? Why do I always feel like I need to fix things? These questions often appear slowly, after years of repeating the same emotional patterns. After many relationships where you quietly took on the role of emotional stabilizer. And when you finally start noticing this pattern clearly, another question often begins to appear. A deeper one. Because once you see how much energy you spend managing emotional stability around you, you may start wondering what is actually happening inside your own emotional system. Why does your mind react so strongly to other people's feelings? Why does tension in relationships activate such a powerful sense of responsibility? And what exactly inside you learn to respond this way? Because understanding the repetition of the pattern is only the first step. The next step is understanding the mechanism behind it. What your mind is actually trying to protect. And why letting other people simply experience their own emotions can sometimes feel so difficult. When you start noticing this pattern in your life, the first reaction is often confusion. You might look at your relationships and think, why do I react like this? Why does someone else's mood affect me so much? Why do I feel responsible for emotions that don't even belong to me? And at first, it can feel like something inside you is simply too sensitive. Like your emotional radar is turned up too high. Like you're always noticing things that other people seem to move past easily. But what often goes unnoticed is that this sensitivity didn't appear randomly. Your mind didn't wake up one day and decide to carry everyone else's emotions. It learned to do that. Quietly. Over time. And once the mind learns a pattern that helps it maintain safety or connection, it tends to keep using that pattern for a very long time. Even when the original situation no longer exists. Because the nervous system doesn't work like a logical system. It works like a survival system. It remembers what once helped reduce tension. What helped prevent conflict. What helped maintain connection with important people. And once those strategies prove effective, the mind keeps them active. Even in situations where they are no longer necessary. This is why emotional patterns can continue repeating long after the original environment has changed. Your adult relationships may be very different from the emotional environment you grew up in. The people around you may not expect you to regulate their emotions. They may not require you to constantly maintain harmony. But your nervous system may still be operating with the same old instructions. Scan for emotional shifts. Notice discomfort quickly. Respond before things escalate. Because at some point in your life, responding early may have been the safest option. The mind learns something like this: if I notice emotional tension early enough, maybe I can prevent things from getting worse. And that belief becomes deeply embedded. Not as a conscious thought, but as a reflex. So when someone's mood changes slightly, your system reacts immediately. It's not just curiosity. It's vigilance. Part of your attention starts working automatically. Looking for signs. Looking for explanations. Looking for ways to restore stability. This is what psychologists often describe as emotional hypervigilance. But that term can make it sound technical or distant. In reality, it feels much more personal. It feels like constantly being aware of emotional signals. Constantly checking the atmosphere. Constantly trying to maintain connection. And the difficult part is that this process often happens so quickly that you don't even realize it's happening. By the time you consciously notice the tension, your mind has already started adjusting. You soften your tone. You become more attentive. You try to prevent discomfort from growing. Because deep down, your system associates emotional tension with risk. Risk of conflict. Risk of disconnection. Risk of losing closeness. And when the mind perceives those risks, it activates the strategies that once helped maintain safety. But here is where the pattern becomes complicated. Because while this sensitivity can help you understand others very well, it can also make it difficult to separate your emotional world from theirs. Someone else feels upset. And your body reacts as if something inside the relationship needs immediate repair. Someone else is disappointed. And part of you feels the urge to correct the situation. Someone else is sad. And your mind starts searching for a way to remove that sadness. But emotions are not problems that can always be solved. They are experiences that people move through. And when your system feels responsible for those experiences, you end up carrying emotional weight that was never meant to be yours. Over time, this can create a very specific emotional dynamic. You become highly responsive to others, but much less attentive to yourself. Your focus moves outward. Toward the emotional environment. Toward the needs of others. Toward maintaining stability. And because of that, certain questions rarely receive attention. Questions like, what do I feel right now? What do I actually need? What would feel honest for me in this moment? Those questions require turning your attention inward. But when your mind is constantly monitoring the emotional landscape around you, that inward space becomes smaller. And this is why people who carry this pattern often describe a strange experience. They feel very connected to others. Very aware of other people's emotions. Very attentive to subtle emotional changes. But at the same time, they sometimes feel disconnected from their own internal signals. They notice everyone else's discomfort first. They respond to everyone else's needs quickly. But their own emotional responses often come later. Sometimes much later. And when those emotions finally appear, they can feel confusing. Fatigue. Irritation. Resentment. A quiet feeling of being overwhelmed. Not because you don't care about people. But because caring has gradually turned into carrying. Carrying the responsibility of keeping relationships emotionally stable. Carrying the pressure of preventing discomfort. Carrying the belief that if something feels wrong between you and someone else, you must have caused it. And this belief can become so deeply integrated that questioning it feels strange. Because for a long time, the pattern seemed to work. It helped maintain relationships. It helped avoid conflicts. It helped keep emotional situations manageable. But eventually, something inside you begins noticing the cost. You notice how much energy it takes to constantly monitor the emotional atmosphere. You notice how quickly your mind assumes responsibility. You notice how difficult it can be to simply allow other people to experience their emotions without stepping in. And when that awareness begins to grow, something interesting happens. You start seeing the pattern more clearly. You start noticing the moments when your mind jumps into responsibility mode. The moment someone becomes quiet. The moment tension appears. The moment disappointment enters the room. And instead of immediately trying to fix the situation, a new possibility begins appearing. A pause. A moment where you begin wondering, is this actually my responsibility? Or is my mind simply repeating a strategy it learned long ago? Because once you begin asking that question, something inside the pattern starts loosening. The automatic reaction becomes visible. And once something becomes visible, it can slowly begin to change. Not by forcing yourself to stop caring about people. And not by shutting down your sensitivity, but by understanding that the emotions of others are not signals that demand immediate correction. Sometimes they are simply experiences that belong to the other person. Experiences they are capable of holding themselves. And learning to allow that, learning to let emotions exist without immediately carrying them, can begin opening a completely different way of relating to others. A way where connection does not require constant emotional management. Where care does not turn into responsibility. And where your attention can finally start returning to something that may have been overlooked for a long time. Your own emotional space. Your own internal signals. The quiet parts of you that were often pushed aside while you were trying to maintain harmony everywhere else. And once that space begins opening again, something else becomes possible. A different relationship with emotions. Not just the emotions of others, but your own. Once you begin noticing this pattern inside yourself, something subtle starts to change. Not immediately. Not dramatically. But slowly. You begin seeing moments that once felt automatic. Moments when someone's mood shifts and your mind immediately starts searching for what you did wrong. Moments when you feel the urge to fix the emotional atmosphere. Moments when someone's disappointment, sadness, or frustration begins to feel like something you must repair. And instead of reacting instantly, you start noticing the reaction itself. The tension in your chest. The familiar thought appearing in your mind. Maybe this is my fault. For a long time, that thought probably felt almost like a reflex. A quiet assumption that appeared before you had time to question it. But when you start recognizing the pattern, something interesting happens. A small space appears between the emotional signal and your response. Just a moment. A pause. And in that pause, a different possibility begins to exist. The possibility that someone else's emotion might simply belong to them. Not to you. This doesn't mean you stop caring about people. It doesn't mean becoming distant or indifferent. It simply means understanding something that may have been blurred for a long time. Care and responsibility are not the same thing. You can care deeply about someone without being responsible for how they feel. You can listen to someone's sadness without needing to remove it. You can witness someone's frustration without needing to correct it. And sometimes, the most honest form of connection is allowing emotions to exist without trying to control them. Because emotions are not always problems waiting to be solved. Sometimes they are simply experiences that move through people. They rise. They settle. They change. And when you begin allowing that natural movement to happen, something inside you also begins to relax. The constant monitoring starts losing intensity. The pressure to stabilize every emotional situation begins to soften. You might still notice emotional shifts. Your sensitivity doesn't disappear. But it stops turning into immediate responsibility. Instead of thinking, what did I do wrong? You may begin wondering something different. What is actually happening here? That small shift changes everything. Because curiosity opens space. Responsibility creates pressure. And when you replace pressure with curiosity, relationships begin to feel lighter. More balanced. More real. You no longer need to constantly adjust yourself in order to maintain harmony. You no longer need to apologize before understanding what actually happened. You no longer need to carry emotional tensions that were never yours to hold. Instead, something much healthier becomes possible. Mutual emotional space. A place where each person is allowed to experience their own feelings. Where sadness doesn't automatically become your task to fix. Where disappointment doesn't instantly turn into your fault. Where emotional moments can exist without immediately becoming a problem. For many people, this shift can feel unfamiliar at first. Because if you spent years managing emotional stability around you, letting go of that responsibility can feel almost uncomfortable. Your mind may still try to step in. Still try to restore balance. Still try to prevent tension. But over time, something deeper becomes visible. You begin noticing how much energy you had been carrying. How much mental space was occupied by constantly monitoring the emotional environment. And when that space slowly opens again, something important returns. Your own emotional presence. Your own needs. Your own internal signals. Because for a long time, those signals may have been pushed aside. Every time your attention moved outward. Every time you focused on stabilizing the atmosphere around you. Every time someone else's emotion became your priority. But those parts of you never disappeared. They simply waited. And when you begin stepping out of the role of emotional caretaker for everyone around you, those parts slowly start becoming visible again. Your fatigue. Your boundaries. Your honest reactions. And perhaps most importantly, your right to exist in relationships without constantly carrying the emotional weight of them. Because caring about people was never the problem. Your empathy was never the problem. Your sensitivity was never the problem. The problem was the quiet belief that connection depended on you managing everyone else's emotions. And once that belief begins loosening, something new becomes possible. Relationships where emotional balance is shared. Where care flows both directions. Where you can finally exist as a person inside the relationship, not as the one responsible for keeping it stable. And when that shift begins happening, you may notice something surprising. The same sensitivity that once made you feel responsible for everyone, can now help you connect with people in a much deeper and healthier way. Not by fixing their emotions. Not by carrying their struggles. But simply by being present. Because sometimes, the most powerful form of care is not solving what someone feels. It's allowing both of you to exist in the same emotional space, without anyone having to carry it alone.